The photograph surfaced unexpectedly, tucked inside a brittle envelope found in the back compartment of an antique steamer trunk purchased at a rural estate sale outside Kingston, Ontario. The trunk belonged to a recently deceased man whose family insisted he had no connection to railway work, no ties to bridge engineering, and no known relatives involved in the 1909 Ontario collapse. Yet inside the envelope lay a single image that contradicted any notion of distance. 5 railway operarios standing before the skeletal frame of an unfinished steel bridge, their faces half lit by winter's pale light, their boots dusted with snow and river frost. The photograph seemed almost too still, too composed, as if capturing the last moment of breath before an unspoken catastrophe. As researchers examined the print, one detail became immediately troubling. On its back, written in faint graphite, were the words, "Taken the morning they warned us." No signature, no date, nothing more. The handwriting trembled slightly, as though the writer had been cold, frightened, or aware of something far heavier than a standard worksite precaution. This thin clue became the first thread in unraveling what had long been treated as a tragic but straightforward chapter of Canadian industrial history, the collapse of the Ontario North Bridge in March of 1909, a disaster that officially claimed 7 lives, including 5 unnamed labourers whose identities were never fully established in public records. The initial investigation into the photograph began with the setting itself. The visible trusses and riveted girders matched construction diagrams from the Ontario Northern Railway archives, confirming the image had indeed been taken on site. The angle, however, was unusual. It was shot from a position workers rarely occupied unless instructed, a narrow timbered walkway beneath the bridge's western approach. Whoever took the photograph stood close to the group, perhaps only a meter away, suggesting familiarity rather than formality. The men's expressions further reinforced this. No one posed proudly or ceremonially. Instead, they appeared wary, distracted, as if unsure whether they ought to be standing still at all. Small inconsistencies began to accumulate. One of the workers, the man on the left with a wool coat patched at the elbow, seemed to clutch something inside his pocket, possibly a folded note or a tool tag. Another worker, positioned slightly behind the others, appeared to be glancing toward the steel support beams rather than toward the camera. The central figure, the only one facing the lens directly, carried an expression that mixed fatigue with an unspoken urgency, as though aware that this photograph would serve a purpose beyond memory. The enigmatic crack, the one later highlighted with a red circle for analysis, barely appeared in the original print, yet even without enhancement, it disrupted the visual harmony of the structure. A diagonal hairline fracture on a rivet plate was not simply a cosmetic blemish. For anyone trained in steelwork, it foretold a potential failure. But the image left unanswered questions. Were the workers aware of it? Had they reported it? And if so, why did official documents later insist no structural defects had been observed prior to the collapse? A retired archivist from the Ontario Railway Museum, upon first viewing the image, remarked that the photograph did not resemble typical engineering documentation, nor the casual snapshots labourers sometimes took as keepsakes. It felt purposeful, deliberate, as though someone wanted proof. As though someone feared the approaching hours and tried, in the limited means of 1909 photography, to capture evidence before it was too late. The central mystery emerged naturally, almost involuntarily. Why was this photograph taken on the very morning the workers allegedly warned someone, and why did none of these men survive the collapse? The more the researchers attempted to situate the image within known historical accounts, the more the silence around the 5 operarios deepened. Their absence from payroll ledgers, the missing names in municipal death registries, the contradictions in coroner reports, all hinted that the photograph was not merely a relic of loss, but the opening clue to a story long buried beneath steel, bureaucracy, and the frozen river that swallowed the bridge in 1909. The photograph's analysis began with a meticulous technical review, carried out by a structural historian from the University of Toronto who specialized in early 20th century steelwork. Under magnification, the hairline fracture on the rivet plate became more than an incidental shadow. It showed uneven surface tension, a slight warping that suggested repeated strain. This subtle distortion was inconsistent with normal winter contraction. According to the historian, the crack appeared to have been forming for weeks. Yet the official 1909 inquiry concluded the collapse resulted from unexpected ice pressure against the central supports, a determination that neatly absolved the railway company of maintenance negligence. The photograph, in a single captured flaw, contradicted that narrative. To contextualize the image, researchers turned to archived correspondence from site engineers and subcontractors. Letters stored in the Ontario Provincial Archives revealed hints of conflict, brief mentions of delayed shipments of high-grade steel, disputes about whether temporary scaffolds had been properly anchored, and multiple requests for additional manpower denied due to budget restrictions. But nowhere, neither in engineering notes nor in company memos, was there mention of a structural defect matching the one visible in the photograph. This omission only grew stranger when a 1908 maintenance report surfaced, documenting earlier stress concerns on the Western Truss. The handwriting resembled the faint graphite inscription on the back of the photograph, though experts could not form a definitive match. As the investigation deepened, the identities of the 5 workers became the next focal point. Census data from nearby towns suggested possible matches: Portuguese and Italian immigrant labourers who had arrived in Ontario during the railway boom of the late 1800s. Yet their names appeared inconsistently across employment ledgers. Some were crossed out abruptly, as if removed after the fact. Others were misspelled or duplicated, common tactics used by contractors of the era to obscure low-wage labour irregularities. A descendant of one suspected worker, interviewed at her home in Sudbury, shared a family story about her great-uncle who went to work on a bridge and never returned. A disappearance her elders attributed not to an accident, but to a warning ignored by supervisors. She had never seen the photograph before, but upon examining it, she whispered that the man on the far right resembled an old portrait kept in her family's wooden chest. Further contradictions emerged in newspaper archives. Articles published immediately after the collapse described the event as sudden, unavoidable, and without prior indication of structural weakness. Yet an unpublished draft of an editorial, found in the private papers of a local journalist, painted a different picture. Unnamed workers had attempted to halt construction that very morning, claiming they had discovered a flaw in the western support that would not hold another load of steel. This editorial never reached print. The journalist's notes indicate that the railway company's representatives visited the newsroom the same afternoon. The photograph's role shifted at this point from artifact to testimony. A forensic specialist scanned the image using spectral enhancement, revealing faint smudges on the workers' gloves, residue consistent with graphite and grease, suggesting they may indeed have been examining stress points before the picture was taken. Even more telling was the posture of the central figure. His right sleeve bore a thin streak of metallic dust, the kind emitted when steel shears against itself under pressure. This was not a crew casually posing. This was a crew interrupted during an inspection, yet not all findings led forward. One engineer, after reviewing the enhanced image, dismissed the crack as inconclusive, claiming that photographic distortion might exaggerate shadows on riveted surfaces. His assessment, though credible, complicated the investigation, forcing researchers to confront whether the photograph proved a structural failure or merely hinted at one. This oscillation between certainty and doubt became the defining tension of the inquiry. The turning point arrived unexpectedly through a retired bridge worker who had access to a private collection of site documents rescued from a demolished storage building decades earlier. Among them was an unsigned memo dated the week before the collapse, warning that recent freeze-thaw cycles are worsening an existing fault in the Western Plate. Inspection required before load extension. The memo was never officially filed. Its description of the fault matched, almost verbatim, the location of the crack circled in the photograph. With this discovery, the narrative shifted dramatically. The photograph was no longer evidence of what happened after the collapse, but of what the workers may have known before it. And more importantly, of what someone else might have chosen not to acknowledge. The breakthrough in understanding the photograph's true significance came only when researchers compared the workers' positions to the structural diagram accompanying the unsigned memo. The circled fracture aligned precisely with what engineers later called a primary load transfer point, a junction where stress concentrated during the placement of new steel sections. If the plate failed there, the collapse would trigger a cascading failure across the western span. This correlation reframed the workers' presence. They were not simply taking a break or posing for documentation. They were gathered at the critical fault line, and the camera captured them in the act of acknowledging a danger they likely believed could still be addressed. The most dramatic revelation arose from a second envelope discovered in the same trunk where the photograph had been found. Inside was a torn fragment of a notebook page, the graphite nearly faded. It read, "We told him. He said the schedule won't move." No names, no dates, no identifying initials. But those words reshaped the entire narrative. They suggested that the workers had alerted a supervisor or engineer of the flaw, and that the warning had been dismissed for the sake of keeping construction on track. Contemporary accounts of railway expansion during the early 1900s frequently referenced the pressure to complete projects before winter thaw, a deadline that dictated wages, political expectations, and the company's standing with government investors. It became plausible, perhaps even likely, that ignoring a structural warning had been a calculated choice. A civil engineer brought in to reanalyze the sequence of events proposed a chilling scenario. If the workers had gathered to show the crack to a superior, the photograph might have been taken either as informal documentation or as a deliberate attempt to create a physical record, something undeniable should the flaw be ignored. The image, in this interpretation, became a silent piece of whistleblowing in an era when workers had almost no legal protections. The engineer's reconstruction suggested the collapse occurred during the afternoon load transfer, only hours after the image was captured. The men in the picture, still alive at the moment the shutter clicked, stood unknowingly in the shadow of their final attempt to prevent what was coming. But the revelation deepened further when the granddaughter of a former site inspector reached out after seeing a public exhibit of the photograph. She possessed a diary kept by her grandfather, a man known to have worked on the Ontario North Bridge in 1909. Though most entries focused on mundane tasks, weather, daily quotas, crew rotations, one entry, dated the same morning as the photograph, stood out. It read, "5 men insist on fault in West Plate. Tension high. Must review after noon meeting." Strikingly, the collapse occurred before the meeting took place. The diary, cross-referenced with company records, indicated that the inspector had been reassigned that morning to the opposite side of the river, leaving the western span unsupervised at the critical moment. This diary entry, paired with the torn note and the memo, reconstructed a chain of negligence more complex than anyone had expected. It suggested a failure not merely of engineering judgment, but of communication, responsibility, and accountability across multiple layers of authority. Where the official investigation claimed unforeseeable conditions, the evidence now pointed toward predictable and preventable risk ignored by decision-makers. A final, haunting detail emerged during an interview with a historian who had studied immigration patterns linked to railway labor. She explained that many foreign-born workers were hired informally or through subcontractors who manipulated names to avoid legal obligations. The 5 operarios in the photograph, she suggested, may have been hired under conditions that rendered them almost invisible in the company's administrative system. Their warnings carried little weight precisely because they occupied the lowest rung of the workforce, men whose deaths, when folded into the official tally, would scarcely disrupt corporate reputation or financial forecasts. This insight reframed the emotional reading of the photograph entirely. No longer were the men simply victims of a tragic accident. They appeared as individuals who recognized the impending danger and attempted to act, only to be overridden by a hierarchy that prioritized speed over safety. The crack circled in the image became the physical symbol of this imbalance. Thin, nearly invisible, yet deadly when ignored. When all findings were assembled, the significance of the photograph crystallized. It was the final trace of 5 men caught between their expertise and their powerlessness, between what they saw and what others refused to see. And as the researchers stood before the enlarged print during the concluding stages of their investigation, one question lingered heavily. Had the photograph been intended as a warning of what might happen, or as evidence for what inevitably would? In the months following the renewed investigation, the photograph took on a weight that extended far beyond its fragile paper surface. Exhibited in archives and community centres across Ontario, it forced a reconsideration of the 1909 collapse, not as an isolated structural failure, but as a human tragedy shaped by systemic neglect. Visitors lingered before the image, tracing the faint outlines of the men's faces, the blurred snowfall, and the circled crack that now appeared unmistakably ominous. The photograph's impact lay not in what it revealed outright, but in the devastating clarity it brought to what had been suppressed. The 5 operarios, once nameless figures lost to time, were slowly reclaimed through oral histories, reconstructed employment notes, and the fragmented testimonies of descendants who had long carried private griefs unacknowledged by the official record. As researchers compiled their findings into a final report, the railway company's historical representatives issued a cautious statement acknowledging possible oversights in the original inquiry. Yet this phrasing felt painfully insufficient. The evidence uncovered, the hidden memo, the diary entry, the torn note, pointed not to oversight, but to a sequence of decisions shaped by deadlines, profit margins, and a disregard for the voices of vulnerable workers. The renewed public scrutiny reignited debates about early 20th century labor exploitation, particularly of immigrant crews whose presence often remained undocumented except in tragedy. For families seeking closure, the photograph offered not vindication, but recognition. A long overdue acknowledgement that their relatives had not simply been swept away by accident, but had attempted in the limited power they held to avert catastrophe. One of the most poignant moments of the aftermath occurred during a community forum held in North Bay, where a woman in her 70s approached the panel with a small wooden box. Inside was a tarnished metal button and a faded scrap of ledger paper bearing a name that matched one of the proposed identities of the workers. Her grandfather had kept these objects without explanation, passing them down as heirlooms despite the lack of direct family connection. She had always wondered why. When shown the enlarged photograph projected on the auditorium wall, she murmured that the man second from the left bore an uncanny resemblance to someone in a portrait her grandfather kept hidden in his study. It raised the possibility that families outside the documented immigrant communities had been touched by the disaster as well. either through friendship, solidarity, or unspoken acts of responsibility never recorded in official accounts. The documentary team eventually reconstructed a tentative roster of the 5 men, acknowledging the gaps that still persisted. The names, drawn from overlapping payrolls, misspelled signatures, and anecdotal recollections, formed a picture more human than authoritative. Yet the imprecision felt fitting. The workers had lived and died in the margins of paperwork, their labor essential, but their identities fragile in the machinery of industrial expansion. To insist on perfect clarity would be to misunderstand the very forces that erased them. As the investigation concluded, the researchers revisited the site of the bridge, now nothing more than scattered iron fragments half buried along the riverbank. Winter winds swept across the frozen water, much as they must have the morning the photograph was taken. The echoes of the workers' final hours seemed to linger, not in the rubble, but in the unresolved questions the landscape still refused to answer. Standing there, the team understood that the legacy of the 5 operarios was not the collapse itself, but the enduring reminder of what happens when warnings go unheeded, and human voices are made secondary to industrial ambition. The final report emphasized that while the photograph could not rewrite the past, it could illuminate the moral cost of silence. The 5 men were no longer anonymous casualties. They became symbols of a historical reckoning that stretched far beyond the boundaries of a collapsed bridge. Their presence in the image, steady, solemn and aware, spoke across more than a century. And in that still moment, captured hours before disaster, they left behind the testimony no one had expected, not a plea for recognition, but a quiet insistence that the truth, however long delayed, must eventually surface. When the documentary's closing narration reflects on the photograph, it does so with the understanding that mysteries do not resolve cleanly. Some details remain elusive, some motivations lost to time. But through meticulous investigation and the voices of those determined to uncover what truly happened, the 5 operarios regain their dignity. The bridge may have fallen, but the evidence they tried to preserve, etched in steel, graphite, and the grain of a single photograph, endures as their final act of resistance.